Hello, good evening. My name is Lyda Dubin. I'm the executive director here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you are joining us for the first time? Any show of hands? Wonderful. Good. Welcome. If you don't know, the Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit. Our mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. So we do it through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joyous story. We run a kids read program offering immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with our first novel prize and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. So visit our site, sign up for our mailing list, and follow us on social media. And to support our work, creating a home for readers and writers right here in downtown Brooklyn, please consider becoming a member so you're tuned in to all of our activities. And come back and see us soon. For example, look at your calendar for July the 10th, when Nana Brew Hammond, the author of Blue and Powder Necklace, joins us to discuss her latest novel, My Parents' Marriage, which explores identity, patriarchy, and community in Ghana and the United States. Live stream and in-person tickets are available now. So for tonight, some logistics. After the talk, we'll have an audience Q&A. So if you're here in the room, please raise your hand, and one of our wonderful interns will bring you a microphone. And please do use the microphone so that the folks on the live stream can hear your question. And for those of you joining on the live stream, add your questions in the chat, and we'll read from those before we break for the signing line. Andrew was kind enough to pre-sign books, so we will be doing a personalization line after the event. So I'll give on information about how that will work at the close of the conversation. And for the main event, we are here tonight to celebrate Caledonian Road, Andrew O'Hagan's ambitious, triumphant new novel that takes on modern Britain with parallels to modern America. On a Dickensian scale, in a style that is wholly his own, please welcome Andrew and Harper's Magazine editor Joanna Biggs to the stage. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all so much for coming. It's such a hot evening, so it's really lovely to have you all here. Now, I came to know Andrew when I got a job at the London Review of Books when I was in my early 20s, a while ago now, and where he's still editor-at-large. And I was really rather starstruck when I first met him. I haven't told him this before. And I feel really lucky to have got to know him as a colleague and a friend over the years that I worked there. He's been actually a really terrific supporter of my own work. I've never really said that in public. And he both guided me through my first attempts at reporting and encouraged me to put together my last book. So it's an honor to get to speak to him about his work. I read this book in this horrible feverish heat we've been having on my fire escape, just absolutely unable to put it down. And I really think it's the absolute perfect novel to be reading right now, just before this election that's happening in the UK on July the 4th, where hopefully we'll have a change of government. Hopefully, surely, right? That'll happen. So Caledonian Road, just to tell you a bit about people who might not have read it yet, it's about the fall of this main character, Campbell Flynn, who's sort of a celebrity intellectual, an art historian, but also it touches all sorts of other parts of society, from like a heroin addict to a duke. So it's just got this breadth and depth and richness to it. I wanted to start just to ask at the beginning, the most boring question there is, but you said in an interview with Anna Ross, The New Yorker, recently, the book began with a scene that you witnessed at the Natural Portrait Gallery in London about a decade ago. Can you tell us a bit about that scene and like how that expanded into this novel?
Sure. It's so nice to be here, by the way. Thanks very much for turning up. It's a hot evening, and it's great to talk to you. I mean, we've been friends for a long time. And the great advantage of speaking to a friend is there's no throat clearing. We go straight to the operatic aria. So I hope we don't disappoint you in that front. More than 10 years ago, I've been saying 10 years. It did take 10 years to actually research and write this book, but the first inkling of it really came when I was suffering what could only be described as a bit of a Julian Assange hangover. I'd been working with Julian Assange and indeed when he was under house arrest. I'd been under house arrest with him in Norfolk, and then in the Ecuadorian embassy when he moved there. We like to start with a topical subject, and there Julian Assange has just landed in Australia, having got his freedom. But all those years ago, when, as you know, because I eventually wrote a 35,000-word piece for you and for the magazine
I remember, yeah.
about it. So I'd sort of had enough of him. That's an easy position to get to, by the way, with that particular individual. But I'd had enough of him, and I'd had enough of being in the embassy in the middle of the night. And I was kind of decompressing from the whole Assangeness of life. And I was in the National Gallery in London, in Trafalgar Square. And I happened to go into the Vermeer room, or the room where the Vermeers are, the Dutch Golden Age spot. And there was a guy across the room, a sort of tall, elegant guy with an unmistakable Scottish accent, speaking to a young man with a backpack. And the brilliance of the relationship was evident immediately. The young guy was answering and questioning everything this, obviously a lecturer or a tutor or a critic, was saying to him. The guy with the backpack was black, and he was saying, every time the guy said, authority or civilization or belonging, he would say, oh, belonging is it? So you know about that, because we wouldn't know about that. He kept coming back at him in the most incendiary and brilliant way, and behind them was the Vermeer. So my eyes kept going from the Vermeer to the Scottish guy. There was a very strong scent of cologne coming from the Scottish guy as well. As a novelist, I think you end up, if you're lucky, once or twice, you're in a situation where you're being gifted a narrative. And I think experience tells you when that is. And I just knew that something in this triangle between the experienced white critic, self-satisfied, successful, smelling of Guerlain, smelling of Mitsuko, actually, if you know your perfumes, and this priceless object of stillness and Western culture behind them, and this young guy just going at him. And the whole novel formed itself in front of me at that point. Then there was 10 years' work, of course, finding the background and the hinterland of all these characters. There's 60 characters in this novel. In that sense, it's unapologetically a Victorian-style novel. But that spark was for real. It was in that room.
What's so interesting to me is the friendship you talk about there. It was a friendship, right? Like, you can't challenge someone on words like belonging and civilization if you're not sort of friends.
There was a sense, actually, it's a good question, that, because what was happening was a dynamic I had never quite seen in a British institutional setting, which was that the young guy was obviously trying to impress his professor, as it were, but at the same time, he was undermining him completely. He was, as it were, unfastening and dismantling the basis of his power to his face. I remember brilliant letters of Allen Ginsberg when he went to Columbia. In one of the letters, there's a brilliant description of the first time he met Lionel Trilling. And Lionel Trilling, a big professor at Columbia at that time, as many of you will know, and just being the sense of my job now at this age and at this present time and in this moment, culturally and politically, is to take you down as a way of establishing my voice. And I think that's what that young guy was doing. And so I wanted to go on a journey into the center of that to see, on behalf of readers, what that drama really was. Because we thought we were on the right side of history. Campbell Flynn's my age. He's got my nationality. He's got a lot of things in common with me, except he's tall. And one of the issues for me was that there had never been a British novel that I had read in which the anti-hero was a liberal. It was always that the establishment figure was some sort of toxic media guy, some abuser, some obvious right-wing thug who'd somehow, got to the center of the establishment, some royal or some duke or some media opportunist. But what I saw in my generation, and I think this is something that's happened internationally, is that often the central character in the dilemma is in fact a liberal, that he or she is on, quote, the right side of history. They've always been a feminist. They've always been questioning the seat of corrupt power. They've always been anti-racist. During the 80s, Rock Against Racism, all of us who were students then, we were proudly, self-consciously questioning Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the seat of conservative ideology. But then we get to be 50. And what have we done, actually, is the question that was arriving in my head, even in that room watching that conversation. What has the liberal intelligentsia ultimately done? As it's accrued great equity in these big houses in London, as it's accrued a sense of prominence in the media and become the central establishment itself, that young guy and his friends and colleagues and girlfriend, as it turns out, a whole generation in the novel, get to say to the liberal, and what did you give up exactly? What did you do without in order to forward this notion of equality? Because our societies have got more unequal. So he was a kind of Tony Blair figure. I once had Tony Blair in a room, and I found that, to my surprise, I wanted to ask him as ferociously as I would have asked Margaret Thatcher, what have you done to, as it were, deepen, human equality? And that is the energy in the book that I wanted to distill. I just couldn't find it anywhere else, really.
And there's so much in that initial encounter you've talked about, both this clash of the generations, this idea of friendship, where it's going, what it does, this idea of what is art doing, how do you get into another person's skin, it just seems incredibly rich. And one thing I sort of do want to get Andy to read, because he's a really wonderful reader. And one thing that's interesting to me in this book is that it has lots of different ideas about friendship, but obviously your previous novel, Mayflies, was about this central friendship, these two
I actually
people.
had a sabbatical in the middle of writing this huge book to write a shorter book, which just suddenly felt kind of morally and emotionally urgent, which turned out to be a book called Mayflies. The book was published during lockdown. I remember calling my publisher in London and saying, this is going to be a quiet one. All the bookshops are closed, everybody's depressed, we're all inside. This is a book about a bunch of friendships forged in working class community in Scotland in the 1980s. And then one of them needs his friends. He's ill 30 years later, and it's about what friendship as a responsibility is like over time. And I said, this is a book of quite highly charged emotionally, and I just don't know that people can handle it, and the bookshops are closed. And then we just watched something happening to this book, which it just became like a kind of rumor. I've been in the game quite a long time. I know the different ways in which books have lives, and I'm very lucky and happy to have been present for different versions of this, but it was something else. And it just took off in a huge way. And but it was actually an interim book. Mayflies, then became a BBC drama, and all sorts of things happened to it. But meanwhile, I was really thinking the whole time about Caledonian Road. But Mayflies has become a kind of a keystone book for me in the bridge of what I've been trying to do. And it gave me the courage, actually, to finish the big book. It gave me the wherewithal, I think, having got there with this notion of friendship and time passing. I then understood Campbell Flynn in a way that I hadn't before. So I then had, 2 years to finish the book, having done Mayflies. Shall I read a little bit of Mayflies?
I would really love you to. And because I'd also like to talk a bit about which ways they're similar or different.
Is this mic on? Yeah? Cool. Just a wee extract, really. So I should just set this up by saying that the boys, a group of working class boys from Ayrshire outside Glasgow have, who are political and anti-Thatcher and love music and addicted to the whole post-punk bands of that period, the Smiths and New Order and The Fall and all that. They get to Manchester for the biggest gig of their lives in 1986, which was a real gig, actually, in July 1986, called the Festival of the 10th Summer, the 10th anniversary of punk in Manchester. Anyway, they've got there, and this is, of course, they're too young to know that this is actually the biggest night of their lives, but I can tell you, it is stroke was. Well, it felt hot. So hot in the early evening. Proper heatwave hot inside the hall. There were black and white banners overhead saying, Festival of the 10th Summer. And they began to drip condensation as if all those summers had come at once. The teenage tribes of Britain became close as the evening arrived. Everyone was leaning towards the stage, emotional and ready for the arrival of something we couldn't exactly place. And up in the seating area, they waved their arms, and I felt the magic of association. It was like a wave of empathy and trepidation all at once, and I wanted those people to be, cared for. I saw Angie up there. A few minutes before 6 o'clock, standing at the outer rim of the hall, I could see her waving down at me from the bank of seats. She radiated alertness with a smile as strong as the feeling in the hall. She waved again and blew me a kiss, holding up a huge paper cup. I made my way closer. I had a standing ticket, and the barrier to the seats was now too well policed. But she ran down and stroked my face and kissed me. I just beamed at her and said nothing. "Make sure you come to the hacienda," she shouted with a hand curved round her mouth. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said back. "Bingo," she said. Then the Smiths came on. Aubrey Beardsley in white jeans, Morrissey in his prime. The singer wafted into view and sold his drowsy reticence like a drug. The band was at its height, romantic and wronged and fierce and sublime, with haircuts like agendas. Morrissey came brandishing a license, a whole manner of permission, as if a new kind of belonging could be made from feeling left out, like nobody knew you, as he did. Time takes nothing away from it. Those thousands of heartened teenagers taking the roof off and giving out to a gawky frontman from Stretford. Tully found me and pushed me down to the stage. Over the speakers, the sound was scratchy, but every word and every guitar lick felt like a statement only they could make, and only we could hear. Those songs rolling from the stage to irrigate our lives. "Oh man, fuck. That's what it's all about," Tully said, kissing me in the cheek as we sang. I could see Limbo at the very front, whirling out of his skin, holding up a smoke and shouting about panic on the streets of Carlisle. Then he was near us and wagging his finger in time to the music, a wonderful look on his face, singing about a vicar, about Joan of Arc, and throwing plastic tumblers into the air. Our hair was soaking wet. The Ayrshire boys appeared from all corners of the room, and we hugged and the music soared, and it seemed like a huge animation of all the things that mattered to us then. Tibbs and Hogg, Limbo and Tully and Clogs, the full brass of being. Oh man. Who knew what time incubated or what life would demonstrate? We were there, beyond navigation, floating through the air. We beamed to the rafters and jumped shoulder to shoulder, and the words we sang were daft and romantic and ripe and British, custom built for the clear-eyed young. The singer threw a spotted shirt from the stage, and a group of lads tore it to ribbons and waved the bits like trophies. "Oh man, he's bigger than Jesus," Tully said. "You reckon?" "Oh aye, bigger, but funnier. He's funnier." They say you know nothing at 18. But there are things you know at 18 that you will never know again. Morrissey would lose his youth, and not only his youth, but the gusto that took him across the stage with a banner saying, "The Queen is dead," is a thing of permanence. We didn't know it at the time, but it was also for all of us a tender goodbye, and we'd never be those people again. "Check Limbo," Tully said in my ear, and I looked to the edge of the stage where the boy himself was spread over a speaker, climbing. Nobody at that age needs more than what Limbo McCafferty had in abundance. He had vitality. He had the spirit of resistance in that single moment. And as the final encore bristled and rose to perfect confusion, Limbo appeared on the stage, going past crewmen and bouncers to take up residence by the drums, dancing and smiling for eternity. The crowd cheering him on, and spiriting the light in his direction. Thank you.
I did tell you. So you've talked about how Mayfly sort of spurred you on to finish this book, but I thought there were other similarities, and I wondered if you had thought about that and what you would think they would be.
It's funny that, I don't know if you feel this as an author yourself, but books sort of accrete. People think it's a bit like sort of, you're a taxi and you just put your light on and sort of somebody hails you. That's what happens in the UK with taxis. I don't know if it happens here, but just a sense that every journey is absolutely distinctly itself. Well, that may be true, but I think what is more important, really, from the point of view of fiction, and this is a centre for fiction, I'm keen to home in on this if we can, is that there's a kind of accretion. One book allows the next, it gives out to the next, and sometimes it causes the next. I remember Philip Roth saying, people would bombard him with sort of non-compliments for some of his books which weren't up to the standard of his better books. And he would say, but you don't understand the process. I had to write that book to get to the one behind it. And that is how a literary artist's work is, I think. The same as filmmakers, that you don't just take on a project and it's a complete life experience in itself. It always relates to the stuff both before and after. And I felt that the relationship between these two books was always almost magical to me, that I was in a kind of heightened state of hope about them both, that I could get something onto the page which was a sort of almost a generational feeling. These two books have been bigger for me than my other books, not because I would argue they're better books necessarily, they're more connected sort of almost umbilically to the time and to a mood than the other ones were. They were on their own slightly more. But I couldn't have written either of these books without having written Be Near Me or Our Fathers or the books that preceded it. I think that's the glory of the task, if you'll accept it, is to see what Norman Mailer once called the nuances of growth. He wrote that in The Village Voice, actually. Unfortunately, it was a very badly subbed magazine in its early days, The Village Voice, and it came out as the nuisances of growth. So it's both the nuances and the nuisances of growth that one has to let the process, just let yourself grow up with it. Make your mistakes. I really like being around theatre people quite often because they're much more like that. I have good conversations with my friend Will Frears, who's here. Often he's talking about plays and what can be done in the room. And I'm thinking as he's talking about what can be done in the study when you're on your own. Of course, it seems less collaborative, except I've always, as you know, had quite a lively relationship with my editors. And I love my editors for that reason, because it's as social as it gets. And I'm in a category error kind of job because I like being among people, but I'm in a room, as it turns out, on my own all day. And it's difficult to throw paper balls across the office when there's nobody to receive them, I've discovered. But yes, for me, it's the trying out over the years, and then finally you might have a production that is absolutely sort of, it seems to be standing up in a different way from some of the others did, and you've just got to know how to stand by that and support it, but also not be afraid that the next thing might again be something which is finding its way towards another tone or a new subject or a new way of hearing. I think that's the job.
No, almost you're talking about sort of the emotional, what brings these books into being, how they come together, because a decade's work is a huge amount of work, and you wrote wonderful pieces alongside that, and lots of other things too. So I almost want to ask a little bit about how the the structure of the book, how it came together. There's a wonderful thing that Campbell Flynn says at some point, and I thought he was maybe talking about the structure of the book as well, because it is this Dickensian thing that's kind of huge and rich and wide, but also very kind of narrow. People are always bumping into each other, like you do in London. London's not as big as New York. You do end up bumping into people. But there's this wonderful quote. Let me see if I can find it. He says, "Every colour is changed by the colour next to it, a truth in painting as well as in society. No life can exist by itself, even in the eyes of God." Now that would be a gift to someone who was writing about any sort of social novel at university. You'd like leap on that quote. And it made me think of the structure of the book as it being exactly this thing, kind of broad and yet tight, and then light and layered. And I wondered like how that was built up over those years.
I'm so delighted you should bring this up, because I think it's essential, this. You know, we've lived through these times of enormous separation about who's allowed to be what and who's allowed to represent what. And, you know, that has validity attached to it too. It's a corrective to too much power mongering and too much power wielding by too many establishments which see themselves almost exclusively as white and male and middle class, middle aged and all that. We get that, and that is actually a brilliant corrective in our times. I've rather liked seeing how many of the institutions that we cared about, whether it be the National Gallery or the London Review of Books or any institution, has actually responded to a big question. Like Milo, my character with the backpack saying, "Oh, so you think you're representative?" Well, every single, painter in this room is white. Every single, these questions had to be posed and they have to be answered, and continually. It's not a phase. This will alter the landscape, I think, permanently. But there's a new aspect to it which I would like to introduce or discuss, which is remembering that we're also breathing air the same way at the same time. We're under the same weather, so separation isn't an end in itself. I think utterly crucial to show discretion and clarity about power, money, corruption and lies, which is what I set out to do in this book, but also to show how human beings across all sorts of boundaries affect each other in a positive way. And if you'll allow me this, it comes from painting this notion. If you look at a Cézanne, for example, the genius of Cézanne's apples isn't just this sort of sense of form and structure, the weird sort of way the painting invites you to complete the painting. It does something to you. It causes you to have to finish the painting. As you're looking at it, it becomes apples in a particular way. It makes your creativity become involved. But also, if there's a plum, the purpleness of the plum is slightly reflected in the peach beside it. The genius of those paintings is that nothing is discretely and only in the universe by itself. Everything in the painting is affected by everything beside it, in terms of shadow, light, occlusion, colour, tone. That's the genius of the painting, and I think novelists have a lot to learn from that. If you would only put characters on the page, not as if each one was a kind of core exercise. Now, I've done that. That's my white male character. Now I'm on to... That's ridiculous, because life isn't like that. Sitting in a subway isn't like that. And our realities are kind of confused and inflected and reflective. I wanted a novel that was a bit like a tube journey in London, where you would walk into the carriage and go, it doesn't matter what my politics are or what I want the world to be like. This is what's happening right now. That old lady is sitting beside a young black girl, is sitting beside a Chinese girl, is sitting beside a man who looks like my dad. What am I going to do about this? Am I going to pretend that that's not the urban experience I'm having, and actually I can only write about what I know, so I've got a carriage full of white, middle-aged Scottish guys? What a horror. Heaven forfend. But anyway, that was the kind of effort. I was really interested in the formal problem of how to do a novel, how to write a novel now with all this kind of interesting hysteria about what was allowed, and just actually take control of it and open up the aperture and include as much as I could, do the work. The 10 years was really the research, Joe, to tell you the truth. I could write the chapters once I had the material, but I had to be 4 months at the Old Bailey which is the big high court in London, as you may know. I had to be with minor members of the royal family. I had to go out for evenings with oligarchs. I had to go with street gangs in South London.
Had to.
That was it. I couldn't have written this stuff. When people say, I remember Joan Didion once saying that she couldn't get students to understand the importance of notes. She said, if you're in a situation and you don't, as a writer, and you don't take notes, you can't write the scene. You simply don't have the notes. You can, Dickens also teaches us this. If you're going to write about an orphanage, go to an orphanage. Don't just guess. Actually go as a writer and experience it and absorb, what do they eat? What's the time? When did they clock off? What are they being paid?
Sounds fun though, Andy.
I love research though. So I'll always do that. I would have done it as a journalist. I always have done it as a journalist, I think. Is to dive into the research and then you find sentences there. That's what I'm trying to say.
The dialogue is really great in here. And I was actually wanted to ask you about the kind of frag head elements, I would call them, christening them just here, but all the kind of, a Marxist would call them commodities, but other people, just the thingness of it. There's all these things, places and things, and it really feels like being in London. It feels accurate to me. I lived there for 15 years. Was that important to you, getting that thingness right?
It was so important. Right? I was in Pittsburgh the other night with James Wood, lovely old friend who writes for The New Yorker. You all know who he is. James famously wrote an essay called Hysterical Realism. Do you remember that? And my argument with James is that the realism isn't hysterical enough. He meant it as a kind of criticism of certain writers putting in too many brand names, or I think he was criticizing Zadie Smith at that time for too many real streets, too many real advertisements. My argument is that the more of that, the better, because I think it is one of the things that makes the contemporary novel contemporary, is that for us, the Gap ad isn't just an other ad. It defines a moment, the Gap ad, as it used to be, or now other ads in products, that you go into a coffee shop and you choose a particular thing, a particular brand. And I think we're in a kind of, for want of a better phrase, a kind of postmodern miasma now, where to sort of be coy about what the brand would be, or just to smoke a cigarette rather than that particular one. I'm interested in that, our relationship with brands, objects, materials. What you're doing when you're writing a big novel is creating a situation of material wealth that allows you to imagine on top. People think research, they've said to me a lot as I've toured around the world with this book, so you found your characters in court, or you went to do the research to find the people. And my argument is no. I went to find the material wealth in which I could bathe my people. So if you've really got to know a gang in South London and they're texting you and you're with them every day and you're in the studio with them when they're recording their drill tracks and you hear them talking, passing joints, talking for months, if you've got a good enough ear, you're eventually hearing exactly how your character will speak if he was with them.
And you have that funny effect. I had it when reading, I don't know the drill stuff. You can sort of tell that that's not really my scene. But I do know
It wasn't my scene either. That may be obvious.
But I do know some of the girls stuff, some of the perfume stuff, some of the particular restaurants. And when that strikes you as correct, then as a reader you can just oh, okay, great. He knows what he's doing. I don't have to worry about this. And so then the rest of the stuff feels like that too. And that it seems important to me as well.
Don't you think it's a kind of trust question? The reader will trust you if you're going to get that kind of thing right. There's a wonderful novelist in Britain called Alan Warner. He wrote Morven Collar, which I think is a terrific novel of the 90s. He's Scottish. Anyway, he wrote in that novel, Morven Collar, there was a certain passage, and I rang him up and said, "This is genius, this book, Alan, and not for the obvious reasons." He said, because he'd been praised a lot, And I said, "There are new reasons to love this book." He said, "What?" I said, "Well, there are only 2 male writers in Scotland that know cleanser, toner, moisturizer. And I'm one and you're the other. Congratulations." And he laughed down the phone. And it's that thing you're talking about. If you get that right, he'd watched his wife or his girlfriend, he just paid attention. There are not that many guys who were doing that then. This is 20 years ago, and maybe still. But we had made it our business to know how to describe a woman in front of a mirror getting washed of a morning. If you're a novelist, you need to make it your business to do that, I would say. And, students are often sort of away in some sort of mega cloud about as it were, the formal philosophical difficulties of writing, when often you want to say, learn how to describe a person in a bathroom who is cleaning their skin. You know, get the language, get the products, even better. You know, if it's Kiehl's, good, get in. You know, that tells you something about that person. You know right away what I mean. It means they've got money. If they're using, you know, creme de la mer, that's a signal. And good readers know how to enjoy those details, just as you would in watching a movie. Suddenly, it's not just any old cheapo moisturizer. That's a sign. And I think that's where we live now.
I wanted to ask a bit as well about some of the female characters in the book, because there were two in particular that there were quite a few. I liked quite a lot of them. One of my favourite characters was Elizabeth, Campbell Flynn's wife. I really took to her. But there were other ones too that I just felt they were unusual in a novel, to have like this kind of wittily tolerant older woman, which is Emily, Campbell Flynn's mother-in-law. And then his daughter, Kenzie, also was a kind of unusual character, like a kind of trendy person who didn't really care about what was happening with the trends. And she was being interested in gardening, all these things. And I wanted to talk a bit about how I think it's not that usual for men to be able to write about women characters who aren't sort of, who don't always have a full life to them. And I felt those really did feel like real people I could have met. And I want to talk to you a bit about the female characters in the book and how they came about.
That was a crucial thing for me. That's when I really knew I had a novel. It was early in the process where those women who really weren't people I could have said I grew up with. You know, the Countess of Paxford living on this incredibly expensive boat that just goes around the world. That is a real thing, by the way. Harper's Bazaar sent me to Venice to climb onto this ship. And the ship was full of very, very wealthy people, but wealthy in a particular way, kind of vulgarly billionaire-ish and Australian, quite a lot of them. Not that those things necessarily have to go together, but in this case they did. And it was quite amusing to see that, you know, basically what they wanted to create was a bubble that sort of moved across the oceans, went to Antarctica, floated round, you know, up by South America, would end up in sort of, you know, Santa Monica for a day, and then would go. This bubble, and they didn't want to be part of the rest of the world, although the ship was called The World, interestingly. Anyway, I went on to this and I found myself interviewing everybody. And as I was doing it, something was happening, and I was creating this elderly English aristocratic woman, this countess who was in her late 80s, who had decided to get away from London society by being on this vulgar ship. And she says herself, this despicable little vessel, she calls it. And she had a way of talking which I'd borrowed some of from a brilliant woman who was the first female producer at the BBC, who became a friend of mine, called Catherine Freeman. In the BBC series The Hour, about the establishing of BBC News in the 1950s, she's the girl in The Hour, a fictional rendering.
The Romola Garai character.
Yes. That was based on a woman called Catherine Freeman, who was married to a man called John Freeman, who did Face to Face, an interview series, famous interview series in the 60s. Anyway, Catherine had a wonderful way of speaking, and she would say, she would quote kind of the poems of Henry Vaughan to you over dinner, and she was marvelously kind of erudite, but at the same time quite bitchy, and she would say, I was once at dinner, you know, with Henry Kissinger, quite a boring man, you know, nothing to say, not good to look at. Anyway, and just that kind of staccato kind of way of, you know, gossiping, and I could hear the Countess. And before I knew it, I had sort of brought these things together. And for me, I knew I had the novel when I could hear the women, because it seemed to me that the women were the people in the novel who really had a grip on things. And the men were all sliding.
I think that's what I liked about them.
Yeah.
Maybe.
They're the ones who actually have a proper bead on what's going on around them. And they're tolerating, as I think a lot of the women in my life have done, the excesses of a kind of male self-importance. Male narcissism is a very interesting thing to handle in a novel, because people like watching men drown, but I didn't just want to watch my central character drown. I wanted the women around him to somehow offer an alternative version of what he could be at his best, and also kind of taking the themes in hand And I think the Countess, Elizabeth, even Mrs. Voiles, although she has all sorts of manias about her, she is right. She's got an argument against these rich people who, you know, grew richer and richer in these houses with equity during the property boom, whilst they lived in these basement flats. You know, I wanted to try and allow the women to have a life that wasn't dependent on men, which was quite, in an opposite way, instructive to the men.
No, I love the bit where he comes across, I hope this is not, I'm terrible at spoilers, but there's a bit where he comes across a note that Campbell Flynn comes across a note that his wife has written, and he says, that's me. And it's a just really wonderful moment in the novel where you realise that, you know, that she's, because a lot of this is done through kind of omniscient, you know, you move in and out of the characters over this thing, but it's got this kind of omniscient third person thing. So you do get access to all sorts of people's brains, and to have that note, it was really striking, I think. It helped the reader.
It's been quite enjoyable. This is a very recent process. This book is set to become a returning television series.
Oh,
and it's got a lot of exciting stuff happening around it at the moment. Scripts are being written, and you know, Johan Renck, who directed Chernobyl for HBO, he has headed up this effort to put it on the screen. And so a new parlour game has started where we're all trying to cast the characters endlessly. So there's a cast of characters at the beginning of this book, and I've encouraged everybody I've ever met to write their ideas of who should be whom. But one of the things it's done retrospectively is it's allowed me to see those characters, some of them, in a new way. That's one of the things that adaptation can do. I had this experience with Mayflies also, seeing it become a screen, have a whole other reality. But I'm most excited in the casting of the women, because I think the women are the various cogs and engines of the whole book, and they have the real power in the book. The men are sort of dismantling all the time, all of them in one way or another, as far as I can see, where the women are sort of trying, if you like, to forge a new way of seeing and a new kind of society out of all this. It's quite a hopeful book in that way. People keep saying it offers a sort of, you know, very, very sort of critical, dark picture of London. But to me, it's my most optimistic book, because things come round to an arrow pointing out. And that was 10 years' work too, not to just drown in the detail.
No, it gets very dark about 2/3 through, but you're right, it does have a different ending. Maybe that is a nice point to open it out to other people. I mean, I've got pages of questions, I can keep going, but I want to open out in case everyone else has things to ask.
Yeah, so we've got the famous roving mic. Here it comes. Down here, please.
There's one right at the front, yeah. Oh, just here.
Hi, it's delightful to hear you. I just finished listening to the book this morning on Audible, and I did appreciate the narrator's ability to do all the necessary accents very much. I'm thinking in the London world that you depict, there's very little about literature, although you're, of course, a novelist and an editor of the London Review of Books, which I tend to read instead of the New York Review of Books. And I mean, maybe that was necessary to craft your omniscient narrator. But I'm curious, well, I guess my question is, what, at this, having depicted this dark, corrupt London, what do you see as the position or maybe the future of serious novels and of endeavors like the London Review of Books?
Thank you for that. I mean, I have to say, you know, as an obvious team member at the London Review of Books and fan, over many decades now, I mean, I feel that the London Review of Books and magazines internationally who have that kind of flavour, although none has the exact flavour of the LRB to my mind, but the position of those magazines has become more and more important as the decades have gone on. When I arrived at the London Review, we used to lie to the editor about how many people were reading the magazine so that he wouldn't get too depressed. We used to say it was 11,000. It was 9,000. And now it's closer to 80,000. Now, here's the news. during all those decades, we've had endless editorials and conversations, endless editorials in the New York Times and every other paper you can think of, talking about the dumbing down of society, the shortening of the attention span, kids are all on their phones, nobody takes reading seriously, nobody can handle big ideas. Nonsense. At least if you look at the 800% increase in the readership of something like the London Review. And further to that, its increasing presence in terms of podcasts, in terms of discussions that are happening online, its blogs. I mean, I'm sure you would have a story to tell about Harper's and its position in America, but I can certainly say that the picture's looking good for those magazines. I say that as somebody who's been part of the scene for quite a long time. It's not a new rodeo for me. I've watched what's happened in literary culture up close. As to why I didn't put it in the book, my friends wouldn't speak to me again. So I tried to keep them out of it. And more seriously, I didn't want the book to become sort of one where Campbell Flynn was drowning in proofs and questions of publication. And it is a world I know very well. It's just a different story. I mean, he does have that in his life. I mean, the London Review actually turns up at one point. One of the characters writes a piece for it. He's the sort of person, as I am, it's one of the things we have in common, who would write for a magazine like that, who would have friends there, who would take an interest in the position of a paper like that, in the culture, in the national conversation, as we used to call it. But I just didn't want to make too much space for it in this book, A, because I had 700 pages already, and that was after cutting. But also, I just found that whatever the locus of his trouble was, it wasn't in literary London itself. That is a subject for another book, for another person, perhaps. And I just feel that, it's a glory, actually, of British culture that we've managed, in a private way, not sustained by government, not advocated by any government department or any officialdom of any kind. We've managed to sustain the tradition of the British essay through decades and find new generations of readers for it every year. So I'm proud of that. And as far as this book goes, I just wanted to leave them alone and let them bask in their success without being satirized or brutalized by the likes of me.
As a follow-up to that, I did want to ask a bit about the reception of the book in Britain, because it was a Sunday Times bestseller. It's a big deal. Lots of people are reading it. And I wondered, did anything surprise you or disappoint you in the kind of reception of people seeing your kind of view of modern Britain?
Well, it's interesting that, because what you don't expect, especially if you've been around and you've written various sorts of novels, is that a book comes out and immediately sort of races into the bestsellers. It went to #1 in the bestseller list and then stayed in the top 10 for 4 weeks, and it's kind of going in and out. And that is quite a new experience for me. I've always had quite a nice time with my books, but this has been instructive in that it tells me something, which is again, I think, an enlargement of your question, which is that I think people are looking for something at the moment which they didn't know they were looking for. And not just from me, obviously, mainly not from me, but from literary culture, from storytelling, I would say more broadly, narrative making, which is that we've lived through these times. And although there is a very healthy and sometimes beautiful and wonderful, yet contemporary tradition of the inward-looking novel, of an autofictional urge towards the hypochondriacal and to the overly internalized, in my view, without, as it were, reference to the outside, I think that there is a countervailing instinct and interest at the moment in what the hell has it been like to live in the world that's changing this fast. And I think that comes round. It wasn't very fashionable until very recently. People talked about the sort of the old-fashionedness of the social novel. It was kind of the thing that Tom Wolfe did in the 80s, or that maybe Jonathan Franzen brought it back a little bit, and it was kind of not quite in the mainstream. But then when one is done, it suddenly is in the mainstream very quickly. So I think there's a returning urge for this. And we have, I don't want to falsely address America. In front of you, you know it better than I do, but certainly in Britain, over the 10 years I was working on this, we already had this austerity, this amazing business of a Tory government imposing austerity on the poor of a country whilst making more and more tax breaks for the rich. That was happening in front of our eyes. Tax cuts being introduced for corporations whilst local libraries were being closed, where children would be gathered, where mothers would have support for the most basic things in their lives. That was happening, and then there was a migrant crisis, and then there was an international pandemic, and then there was, and in between all that, there was Brexit. And the idea that you can be a novelist and just ignore that because you feel a bit depressed and you want to write about that, well,
that's not what they're always doing. But
that's not what they're always doing. Good luck to them. And as I said, beautiful things being done, but also I think beautiful things can be done with the broader canvas. Put it that way.
Are there any more? Oh, there are. Great. There's one down here, and then there's one back there as well.
But Andrew, I've been reading you for many years in your many forms, and thank you so much for being here. And it's wonderful to hear you speak in person. I want to ask you about the end of Mayflies. I actually found the ending incredibly optimistic, although it's difficult. But this last sentence, the last moment where Tully lifts his arms overhead. I wanted to ask, when that came to you, was that an intuitive choice? Did you know when you set out at the beginning to tell his story?
Yes. I knew that scene, that moment, was going to close the book. The book both opens and ends with football. And there's an internal rhyme in that which was absolutely there from the very first draft. I sat down to write that book. I always write the first draft, some of it by longhand, and then move on to an old typewriter. And I remember clacking in this caravan that I had on the west coast of Scotland through that part of the winter. And I knew as I typed the first sentence that the very last sentence of the book would be Tully scoring that goal and raising his hands, triumphing over death, triumphing over the impossibility of being fully loved or engaged with by his father, that his past would be lived through and lived beyond in some way. It doesn't always happen that way. I mean, sometimes you have to fight for the end. You don't know what it is. You have to feel your way back and forward. Sometimes you have to fight for the title. I've had novels where I've been fighting for the title when the book's in proof. Still not happy with the title, still urgently going back again. I believe there is a kind of platonic, perfect title out there for each book, and your job is to find it. But with this, when I wound that first piece of paper into the typewriter, I typed the word Mayflies, a novel, Andrew Hagen, and then typed the full first paragraph as it exists now, with a few corrections, but not many. And that is just a description of one version of writing a novel. I tell you, there are 1,000 other ones which involve ripping the paper up, throwing the typewriter into the bin, taking up smoking again, sort of, throwing yourself out the window. I mean, there's all sorts of other ways. But that was a happy way. And I loved the fact that I knew from the beginning just how it should end. It seemed to me the book was preordained. I felt I was transcribing that book in a way. I know that's a bit mystical, but I really did. I feel the book was there. All I had to do was listen out for it and write it down.
There's another question further back as well.
I'm just curious if you, at any point, had any thought of writing your big book and setting it in Caledonia and not Caledonian Road. I mean, it's there's Scottishness, but not a lot of Scotland necessarily in your book. Just wondering if that ever was at any point occurred to you.
Thanks for that. I mean, I do think that, again, right from the beginning with this book, I realised that there was a big part of Scotland which has always been in our lives in Scotland, which is London. I remember going past the British Museum once with our friend Colm Tobin, the Irish writer, and Colm looked at the British Museum, with its amazing classical front and its pillars, and he said, "I'm glad we built it, are you?" And he meant the Irish and the Scots. And he said, in fact, he looked around and he said, "London, it is a part of Ireland, it's a part of Scotland. We built it, it's ours." Which is a very kind of humorously anti-English thing to say, but it's also true. And when I was growing up, yes, we were in Scotland. Yes, there was Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dumfries and Aberdeen and Dundee and everything else. But there was also London. There was also always an Uncle Stephen who'd taken the bus from Buchanan Street and gone to London and never come back. Just as in Ireland. I mean, they would say that about America and Ireland too. That's why Brooklyn, here we are. She went to Brooklyn. That's how he got that novel. Because there's always a Brooklyn. Just as there's always a London. For generations of Celtic individuals, especially in communities like that, where there were various absolutely known options in life. You could get married young and have children and get a job in a factory. You could do this or that. You could become a teacher. Or you could just get the bus to London. And many, many people did. So I'm not being facetious, but I always felt that there would be a London Scottish novel in me, because I always felt that London was a kind of suburb of Glasgow. And that if I could only write that book, and then I was gifted the title, because Caledonian Road, of course, has a Scottishness in the title. And indeed, a lot of Scottish pubs in Caledonian Road, a lot of Scottish stores there, and a sense of Scottish people coming to London and taking over. At one point, there was nearly every member of Blair's cabinet was a Scot. Do you remember that? There's a sense of Scotland had sort of colonised London in quite an exciting way. But I think just this once, because every other one of my books is mainly set in Scotland. And I just felt that this was a different way of going at the question of Scottishness, which is mainly about kind of self-imposed exile and working your way back, and having a Scotland, a hinterland, a backstory, which is to do with nationhood and belonging, a kind of out-there-ness in your life, a black backing on the mirror that allows you to see your own face, which is what nationhood is for some of us. It's not a core identity, as if I've been walking around London in tears, although I have. Missing Scotland. I've felt very happily Scottish in another place other than Scotland, and I wanted the novel to carry that feeling. But it's a good question because, could you write a State of the Nation novel set in Glasgow? Is really the core. And maybe, of course you could. It's just that this wasn't that. I needed a House of Lords. I needed the Wolseley. I needed the opera. I needed Garsington. I needed all that poshness and strangeness that just doesn't exist in Glasgow. There's a sort of middle class in Glasgow, but there's not Garsington. There's not the Royal Academy. So this was a social novel in the tradition of big London novels, but with a bit of a Scottish twist.
I had the reverse experience, actually. It made London seem Scottish to me in all these ways I hadn't really ever noticed when I lived there. So it can have the other reverse. Are there any more questions? Oh, there's one there. Right, just...
I was just interested in what you were saying about writing from a different perspective, because I do feel like in publishing, writing from an identity not your own has just been like a somewhat hotly debated topic, and how to do it well and responsibly. And I feel like I personally, maybe there are 2 male authors who I've read and been like, nice, they wrote a woman really well. So I'm just wondering if you think the antidote to that is purely just 10 years worth of research, or is it a particular mindset or willingness to, like, you'd think if it's just research, more people would be better at it. But what do you think?
It's not just research. If you're talking about writing a female character, it's the business of a whole life. I mean, I was born of a woman. I have a woman for a mother. I've had women at the center of my life all my life. I'm married to a woman. It's not research. I would research as much as I could. I guess, my example, my slightly comical example about, cleanser, toner, moisturizer, that's research, although it's not really. You just pick that up in a marriage or in a household. Or you've asked a really interesting question, because I don't really know what the difference between research and experience is when it comes to that. I just know that if you're a novelist or any sort of writer, you're constantly sensitive to stuff. And, if you go to bed with a woman every night, there's going to be things that you understand and know about female bodies. There's going to be stuff you know about, not all women, but that woman. And then you'll invent a woman, and you'll be drawing, of course, on your whole life. Obviously we don't remember emerging from a woman's body, but we did, and we had that relationship with our mothers, our sisters, our aunts. And in my case, I can tell you that the most important informative people in my life are always the women. It tells in all sorts of ways, including, cleanser, toner, moisturizer, but also my temperament, my politics, my sense of right and wrong, my sense of fairness, my sense of listening to people. I didn't have any really influential formative men in my life. My father was absent. My mother and my aunts and my mother's friends were at the center of our lives. And I could really, when I write a boyhood memoir, which I will eventually, they will be the central characters. And I think it leads me, if I can be explicit about it, to write a book like this in which really the sort of moral engines in the book are the women. It doesn't entirely answer your question. I don't know how to explain how you get to confidence about the women, but I just, obviously you have a lot of readers when the book's in manuscript, and I think all those women, and I've always had 6 or 7 women who read my books in those early stages, and they would tell me, I think, if something was absolutely rubbish.
Jean would tell you.
Rubbish. Jean McNichol, Nikki Wilmers. I've always had amazingly intelligent women reading my books, and they wouldn't let me away with anything. But it's a hard question because I know that in this country, it's not so true in Europe, but in this country there is a sort of almost an ideological edge to this question. I mean, in terms of, is it right? Does a male writer have the right to impose, personate, and appropriate? And I don't mean to, despite some of my jokes, I'm not in any way one of those people who wants to dismiss that. I just had to not be overwhelmed by it when writing a book where, of course, there were going to be female characters. And I hope that I constructed them in a way that my readers can trust in them. But I don't think I've solved the puzzle. You never solve the puzzle. It's just my offering, as it were.
Yeah, thank you.
That's all the time we have for questions. Andrew, that was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, being so honest, and the reading was amazing. And I know that you'll have more questions, and Andrew will sign books, so you can come and ask him more things then. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for this gorgeous conversation. I'm just going to do a little bit of stage direction in addition to the thank you. We're going to set Andrew up to sign right through these doors. So if you'd like to get your book personalized, please just sort of line up in here, and we'll get you set up. And just, again, thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming. Good night.